Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the new Fujinon XF 30mm F2.8 LMWR-R macro lens. I'll be giving you my conclusions up front for those looking for a quick review, and then I'll have a detailed image quality breakdown at the end of the video for those that want the deeper dive. The XF 30mm macro is a 1:1 macro lens with a full-frame focal length equivalent of 46mm. This provides a very different angle of view than the other two lenses and will in many ways be the most flexible lens for other types of photography other than macro. Think of it maybe as a normal lens that also happens to do macro. Now, in case you don't speak Fuji, here's what all those letters mean. LM refers to linear motor, indicating that we have Fuji's premium focus system here. WR refers to weather resistance, pointing to a premium build, and R refers to the aperture ring, which is standard on Fuji primes. The headline feature in terms of the build is how compact and lightweight the lens is. It is only 60mm in diameter, or 2.4 inches, and right under 70mm, or 2.7 inches in length, and it weighs only 195 grams. That's only 6.9 ounces. This is a truly portable package, and when you consider that it has a good weather-sealed build and a nice-feeling manual focus ring, it seems like fairly good value for money at its $600 US asking price. This is a 1:1 macro lens, but getting that full magnification does come with some challenges. The minimum focus distance here is just 10 centimeters, and I measured the distance to the front of the lens from the sensor at 9 centimeters. That leaves just 1 centimeter between the camera and the subject, meaning that you can't even mount the included lens hood at 1:1 macro distances, as the total length with that mounted is 11.5 centimeters, putting your subject inside the lens hood. You'll have to be very careful about your lighting and make sure that the lens doesn't shade the subject at close focus distances. Autofocus comes via the linear focus motor, and the 30mm macro delivered some of the best autofocus that I've yet seen on a Fuji lens. Focus is fast, quiet, and smooth. I was most impressed for video work, where for perhaps the first time I saw focus pulls about as smooth and fast as equivalent performances on Sony or Canon when mounting the lens on the new Fuji X-T5. I was also impressed with the performance during my hand test, as focus moved back to my eye quickly and confidently without any pulsing or settling. I had good focus accuracy during my review, with successful autofocus even up close at macro distances, though I still prefer manual focus there. I also saw accurate autofocus even in very dim conditions, like these shots taken at ISO 6400. Though very small, the 30mm macro has a fairly complex optical formula of 11 elements in 9 groups. The MTF chart shows a strong center performance, but with a pretty huge dip in the midframe that essentially levels out to the corners. I found that to be the case in my own test as well. I gave the lens a torture test by testing it on the 40-megapixel sensor of the X-T5, and what I found was very good results in the center, fairly good results comparatively for corner performance, but I was disappointed by the mid-frame results. The new Viltrox 75mm f1.2, for example, was sharper in the mid-frame at f1.2 than the 30mm macro was at its peak performance at f5.6. Detail in the sweet spot of sharpness is pretty good, but I will say that I wasn't wowed by the optical performance here. Chromatic aberrations are very well controlled, so fringing won't be a problem of either kind. Fuji's correction profiles do a good job with vignette and distortion, but without correction there is a fairly strong amount of pincushion distortion and a severe amount of vignette. The vignette required me to max out the sliders to manually correct for it, and I did note that in higher ISO situations, the profile correction did introduce additional noise into the image along the edges of the frame. I also was somewhat disappointed by the aperture blades that didn't do a very good job of maintaining a circular shape. I saw the edges of the blades in specular highlights starting at f4. The wider focal length and only average maximum aperture means that creating a lot of creamy bokeh will be difficult with this lens. I found the overall quality of the bokeh to be average as well. What I did really like was the color rendition from the lens. Colors are rich, contrast is fairly good, and I like the overall feel of many of the images I took with the lens. If you want a deeper dive into that optical performance, stay tuned for the latter portion of the video. In conclusion, the strength of the Fuji 30mm f2.8 macro is in its great versatility. In such a compact, lightweight package, you have a normal focal length, which is useful for many things, but also a macro lens at the same time. I do think there were probably some optical compromises made to keep the lens so small and light, but of course the trade-off will be in the great versatility of the lens and its portability. I suspect that this will be a very popular lens for Fuji shooters. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, stay tuned for the deep dive into the optics or check out my text review that is linked in the description as well. You'll also find links to an image gallery along with buying links there. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in. So let's head into our deep dive into the optics here, starting with the vignette and distortion. The correction profile here does a good but imperfect job of correcting everything. I still see a little bit of uncorrected distortion and definitely some uncorrected vignette. However, this is what we're starting out with, so the profile is having to correct a fair bit. There is a fairly strong amount of pincushion distortion that required a -9 to correct 4, and as you can see, a very heavy amount of vignette that required me to max out the sliders to achieve this end result, which I think is a better overall correction than what the standard profile does. And while the correction profile does a good job, for example, here you can see on the corrected image on the left how much brighter the plates are than the vignette affected plates on the right side. But what we can also see that if we zoom in to a pixel level, we'll find that there has been a lot of additional noise introduced into the shadow area. And if we look at this area of the image, we can see also that some detail has been lost due to the amount of correction that has had to take place here. So there is some consequence for that amount of vignette correction, particularly at higher ISO settings. On a more positive note, there is basically no longitudinal chromatic aberration here at all, and you can see that before and after the plane of focus, there's no visible fringing and very good contrast on our subject there. I also found that lateral chromatic aberrations were well controlled with only the faintest tint of some fringing there, but overall a very nice transition from black to white along the edges of the frame. Now, as noted, we are doing a bit of a torture test when it comes to the resolution by using the new very high resolution 40 megapixel sensor of the Fuji X-T5. Looking at 200%, which is the level I do these tests at, we can see that in the center of the frame, the performance is nice and good. Good contrast, good detail there, as the MTF chart shows. If we pan just a little bit over towards the mid-frame, however, we can see that there's quite a significant drop-off in resolution and not nearly as sharp or as contrasty there. We can see it down at this edge, see it over on this side as well. Now, if we look down into the corner, I actually find that the corner performance, of course with reduced expectation for the corners, actually look fairly good with, so-so, but fairly good contrast, but detail is good right off to the edge of the frame. Now, in real-world results, I found that resolution, if you could catch the sweet spot, was fairly good. We can see in the shot of Nala that there's good, though not great, detail around her eyes. Looking at this shot outdoors and a little bit more forgiving lighting conditions, we can see that the detail here is quite good, with good contrast here in the sweet spot of the frame, which as you can see is focused a little bit closer to the center of the frame than what the previous shot was. And if you can catch this part of the frame, you can get very good results. Stopping down to f4 provides a bit of a contrast boost in the center of the frame, as we can see here. In the mid-frame, we can see really not much of an improvement. It's basically about the same as what we saw at f2.8. Down into the corners, there's not necessarily a lot of additional resolution here, but you can see some improved contrast that has come into, particularly as you look over at the figure here. Looking over on this side of the frame, we can see that that contrast shows a little bit more. Look at the brightness of the dark part of the eye versus the bright part of the eye, which is a little bit more pronounced over here. There is a tiny bit more to be gained at f5.6, also over into the corner. In the center of the frame, we have maxed out, but it's not a whole lot of difference between f4 and f5.6. And here in the mid-frame, really not a whole lot of improvement. And unfortunately, this is about as good as it gets in the mid-frame. Stopping on down to f8, if anything, is just a hair softer due to diffraction here on this high-resolution body. In fact, we can see if we look at minimum aperture compare with maximum aperture, how big of a difference there is and how much diffraction affects the image quality. So you're probably going to want to avoid going past f11, particularly if you're shooting with one of the new high-resolution bodies. While we have noted the challenges of getting up close to your subject, if you can get there and get decent lighting, performance is quite good, particularly again in that sweet spot where, as you can see here, resolution is nice and high. You can see all the little bits of ink and some of the fibers from the paper there. Very impressive performance. Plane of focus isn't perfectly flat, but hardly expected with a wider angle lens and also at such a close focus distance. As noted, I was very happy with the color rendition here. Colors had a very nice feel to them in images with a nice level of saturation without being overdone. And if we move into a little bit, more deeply colored scene like here, you can see that the colors look very nice and rich. And of course, if we pop into a pixel level, particularly here in the center of the frame, everything looks really, really nice. I'm very pleased with the overall look of the image that I saw here. At macro focus distances, it really helps to have such low longitudinal chromatic aberration. So even with a shiny surface like this, you can see that there's basically no fringing to be seen, which does help with the resolution up close. And as you can see, for example, here on this camera that I'm testing, phone that I'm testing right now that I used as a test subject here, you can see I was able to produce really nice looking macro detail on the image. As noted previously, I was less delighted with the overall bokeh quality. Now, for some reason, you can ignore the dots, but I don't know why there is some dust in the lens already. But we can also see that there is a certain amount of busyness inside the circles themselves, some pronounced inner lining, and you can see that very quickly we move towards a kind of a cat eye or lemon-shaped deformation as soon as you get away from the center. As noted, however, you can see even at f4 the aperture blades quite clearly pronounced, so you lose that truly circular shape, and here at f5.6 they are more pronounced still. If you can compose with the specular highlights towards the corner, you're going to see a lot of that cat eye effect. Maybe that bugs you, maybe it doesn't, but anyway, I just wanted to show you that performance. Now, in this case, we have fewer specular highlights, so that becomes less of a concern. What we can see is that the detail in the center of the frame is really nice, and I think it's handled this scene reasonably well, but you can also see that you're not able to truly blur out the background all that much at this kind of distance due to the shorter nature of the focal length. Now, when it comes to flare resistance, I was quite impressed. Here we have very bright sun that is reflected. You can see no ghosting artifacts. Contrast is still good. Also in this shot, a little bit further back, we can see again, the sun is very, very bright, but nothing is damaged. And finally, in this image here, again, kind of the double whammy of both the original and then the reflected sun. And this was about as much as I could come up with in terms of a ghosting artifact. So in general, I'm quite pleased with the flare resistance. So optically, this is a nuanced performance. There are some real strengths. There are also a few weaknesses, and you'll have to make a determination for yourself whether the compact size makes it worth some of those optical trade-offs.